دوستان عزیز دوستان عزیز، با سلام و شب بخیر خدمت یکایک شما عزیزان. اجازه بدید که برنامه امشب رو شروع بکنیم. من ناهید رازی هستم، از اعضای هیئت مدیره انجمن متخصصین ایرانی در سندیگو و خوشحالم که امشب میزبان شما در این جلسه هستم. به همراه من آقای محمد حسین نادری و همچنین آقای پدرام عباسی و خانم آرزو مدیریت قسمت‌های مختلف سوشیال میدیا، اینستاگرام، تلگرام و فیسبوک ما رو به عهده دارن. آقای نادری اینجا مدیریت قسمت زوم رو به عهده دارن و من از همه دوستان متشکر هستم. امیدوارم که هیچ یک از شما رو جان انداخته باشم. خیلی ممنونم که امشب ساعتی از وقتتون رو با ما میگذرونید. ما هم مثل همیشه سعی کردیم که بهترین هایی رو که در توان داریم برای شما فراهم بکنیم و امیدواریم که شما از این برنامه استفاده بکنید و از وقتتون لذت ببرید. مهمان عزیز امشب ما آقای دانیل توانا هستند از دانشگاه ییل که از شرق آمریکا به ما پیوستن و من واقعا از طرف خودم و از طرف انجمن متخصصین و همچنین همه شما دوستان از ایشون تشکر میکنم که در این ساعت شب دعوت ما رو پذیرفتن و به ما پیوستن. خیلی ممنون آقای توانا. قبل از اینکه به معرفی موضوع سخنرانی امشب و همچنین معرفی بیشتر مهمان عزیزمون بپردازیم، اجازه بدین که چند نکته و چند مورد رو که در مورد برنامه‌های ماه آینده انجمن هست به اطلاعتون برسونم. حتما میدونید در جلسه قبل هم عنوان شد که ما امسال خوشبختانه بعد از 2 سال پیکنیک سالیانه انجمن رو برگزار میکنیم و هممون خیلی از این مسئله هیجان زده هستیم. این پیکنیک واقعا خود من 20 و چند ساله که همیشه به عنوان عضو به این پیکنیک آمدم و هیچ وقت اولین باره که من درگیر تدارکات این پیکنیک هستم یا حداقل مشاهده میکنم تدارکاتی رو که بقیه دوستان دارن انجام میدن و میبینم که از 2 ماه پیش همه در تدارک انتخاب محل، اجازه گرفتن محل و بیمه و تمام تدارکات دیگه هستن که من همینجا واقعا میخوام از همه دوستان تشکر بکنم، به خصوص آقای حمید شقاقی و آقای ارسلان دادخواه که واقعا تا اینجا تمام این اجازه ها و این پرمیشن ها و این شرایط قانونی رو برگزار کردن و ما هر هفته برای این تدارکات باید جلسه داریم و خلاصه برای خود من خیلی جالبه که امسال اینوالو هستم و میفهمم که چه نیرو و چه انرژی و وقتی در پشت این برنامه‌ای که من 20 سال شرکت میکردم و میدیدم که چقدر زیبا و خوب برگزار میشه، چه انرژی پشت این گذاشته شده. به خاطر همین واقعا ازتون دعوت میکنم و توصیه میکنم که حتما در پیکنیک امسال که در آگست 22 آگست همین سال حدود 3 هفته دیگه فکر میکنم برگزار میشه در پارک سندیگو در سندیگو، حتما شرکت بکنید. شما همه کم و بیش آشنا هستید، میدونید که پیکنیک سالیانه AIAP واقعا از پرطرفدارترین و محبوبترین برنامه‌های گرد همایی‌های سندیگو هست، به خاطر اینکه تمام مزایای یک گرد همایی رو با هم دیگه داره. این پیکنیک اولا برای قدردانی از اعضای انجمن ترتیب داده میشه شده در تمام طول این سالها و همینطور امسال، بنابراین برای اعضای انجمن رایگان هست. یه پیکنیکیه که شما وقتی میایید فقط میتونید اون زیر انداز خودتون هر چی میخواید که روش بشینید اونو بزنید زیر بغلتون، بیاید بهترین غذا، پذیرایی ایرانی، گریل، نمیدونم کباب، جوجه کباب، همه اینا در پارک تدارک دیده شده. بازی‌های مختلف، ورزش‌های مختلف برای همه سنین، از بچه‌های کوچیک تا پدر بزرگا، مادر بزرگا، و واقعا یک روز کاملا سالم و شاد و در طبیعت میگذرونید که ما واقعا منتظر هستیم که یک شما رو در این پیکنیک ببینیم. فقط برای اینکه تدارکات ما منظمتر باشه و بهتر باشه و اضافه و کم نباشه، خواهش میکنیم که تمام اعضا، همه شما که میخواید شرکت بکنید در این پیکنیک، حضورتون اعلام بکنید، به اصطلاح RSVP بکنید که اینو میتونید با جزئیات در وبسایت ما ببینید. و موقعی که RSVP میکنید یه $10 شما فقط به عنوان این تضمین این که شرکت میکنید میپردازید، ولی این $10 بعداً باز به شما بازگردانده میشه. اگه خواستید دونیت میکنید، اگه نخواستید بدون هیچ سوال و هیچ پرسشی به شما بازگردونده میشه. بنابراین پیکنیک برای اعضا رایگان هست و این قدردانی از اعضا هست، ولی اگر شما عضو هم نیستید، واقعا من توصیه میکنم بهتون که حتما عضو بشید، به خاطر اینکه بخشی از عضویت شما، مقدار زیادی، شاید نصف از عضویت شما با همین برنامه پیکنیک، با تیکت پیکنیک پرداخته میشه. ولی اگر باز هم نخواهید عضو بشید ولی باز دوست داشته باشید که به ما بپیوندید، خیلی خوش آمدید. فقط باید تیکت رو میتونید همونجا بیاد بگیرید از ما توی محل. ولی خب یه خورده اشکال پیش میاد، برای اینکه چون ما نمیدونیم چند نفر واقعا اون موقع به ما اضافه میشن، مجبوریم که اول کسایی رو که RSVP کردن سرو بکنیم و بعداً. بنابراین مجددا من توصیه میکنم بهتون که حتما اگر عضو نیستید عضو بشید و RSVP بکنید از طریق وب پیج و با این پیکنیک به ما بپیوندید. بسیار از حضورتون خوشحال میشیم. دوستای خوب پیدا میکنید برای تمام به اصطلاح سنین و افراد خانواده. این در مورد پیکنیک. میدونید که ما هر ماه هایکینگ داریم و هپی آور داریم. من بازم شما رو دعوت میکنم که به پیج ما مراجعه کنید و توی این فعالیت ها به ما بپیوندید. وقتی همطور که گفتم، میگم مسئله عضو شدن شما این مزیت رو داره که خب حالا در همین موقع میتونید پیکنیک هم بیاید، ولی من یه خواهش دیگه هم ازتون دارم که کسایی که آردی عضو هستن ازتون دعوت میکنم که برای ماه نوامبر که ما انتخابات داریم و هیئت مدیره جدید رو انتخاب میکنیم، حتما خودتون رو کاندید بکنید. میدونید که هیئت مدیره انجمن هر 2 سال یک بار تجدید میشه و ما امسال 3-4 نفر داریم که 2 سال کمک کردن، خدمت کردن و امسال ما اعضای جدیدی به هیئت مدیره اضافه میکنیم. حتما ازتون دعوت میکنم که یا خودتون نامینیت بکنید خودتونو، و یا اینکه اگر دوستانتون هستن که فکر میکنید میتونید اونا رو نامینیت بکنید، به ما معرفی بکنید و در به پیج تمام این اطلاعات هست. در اینجا من اجازه میخوام که خیلی سریعتر بخوام رپ بکنم. فقط میخوام تشکر بکنم از سپانسرای ما که بیزنس های بسیار معتبر و مورد اعتماد شهر هستن که همه مردم شهر رو پشتیبانی میکنن و من فکر میکنم که ما هم وظیفه داریم اونها رو پشتیبانی بکنیم. سپانسرای ما خانم سوگند گویا در SG Creative Design که خدمات وبسایت و خدمات بازرگانی انجام میدن، خانم دکتر الهه طلویی که متخصص امراض داخلی و پزشک خانواده هستن، 2 مطب در لمسا و الکهان در سندیگو دارن، بارونز مارکت که چند تا شعبه در نقاط مختلف شهر دارن، کازمیک سولار که خدمات گرمایی استخر و خونه ها رو انجام میدن و رایت فامیلی دنتال آقای دکتر ناصر استاد دندان پزشک هستند، آقای علی گلچین از دفتر وکالت گلچین که از وکلای قابل اعتماد و بسیار قوی در سندیگو هستن. من خودم تجربه شخصی باشون داشتم. و بالاخره رستوران صوفی که همتون باهاش آشنا هستید و غذای روز پیکنیک رو هم ما با رستوران صوفی قرارداد داریم که میان اونجا و تمام بساط گریل و پلو و خورش و همه اینها رو میارن و پیش غذا، خود غذا، دسر، تمام اینا تدارکاتی هست که رستوران صوفی قراره برای ما انجام بده. این از مسائل هاوسکیپینگ بود که من زودتر رپاپ بکنم و ما با این با رپاپ اینا برسیم به سخنرانی امشب ما. سخنرانی امشب، عنوان سخنرانی has public opinion on survey research in Iran, challenges and opportunities. که من ترجمهش کردم، سخنرانی هست در مورد عقاید و دیدگاه‌های مردم عادی و بررسی همه‌پرسی در ایران. فکر میکنم مسئله همه‌پرسی و آماری که از همه‌پرسی‌ها معمولاً میاد بیرون برای همه ما کم و بیش یه مقداری به اصطلاح قابل اطمینان نیست و مشکوکه، به خاطر اینکه آماری که از داخل ایران میاد و به وسیله دولت انجام شده همه‌پرسی‌هاش تا یه حدی ما میتونیم بگیم که بی‌طرفانه نیست. آماری هم که از خارج ایران توسط میدیای خارج فراهم میشه اونها هم احتمالاً بی‌طرفانه نیست و اونچه که در این وسط گم میشه واقعاً عقاید مردم ایرانه، دیدگاه‌های مردمیه که دارن اونجا زندگی میکنن و در مورد مسائلی که روزمره باهاش مواجه هستن شاید اینا واقعاً گم بشه در این آمارگیری هایی که هیچ کدوم بی‌طرفانه نیست. بنابراین تو این مسئله سازمانی که بی‌طرف باشه و آگاهانه و به طور آکادمیک و علمی بتونه این همه‌پرسی رو انجام بده که اطمینان آدم داشته باشه به اون نتایج اون همه‌پرسی، من فکر میکنم روشنگری زیادی برای جامعه ما به وجود میاره و این اون کاری هست که بخشی از تحقیقاتی هست که آقای دانیل توانا در سالهای به اصطلاح اخیر که در دانشگاه پرینستون و در دانشگاه ییل دارن انجام میدن که خودشون بیشتر در موردش برای شما توضیح میدن. من امشب تشکر ویژه دارم از آقای توانا به خاطر اینکه در این موقعیت خاصی که خودشون توش قرار دارن پذیرفتن بیان با ما صحبت بکنن، به خاطر اینکه ما فقط همین ماه جولای رو داشتیم که ایشون بیان. حالا میگم براتون چرا. ایشون این هفته، یعنی تا آخر این هفته، تز دکترا خودشون رو دارن به دانشگاه پرینستون سابمیت میکنن و تا ماه دیگه دارن این تز رو ازش دفاع میکنن و همه اونایی که درگیر این مسائل هستن میدونن که این هفته ها چه هفته های پرکار و استرسفولی هست برای یه نفر که بخواد حالا یک چیز اضافه هم قبول بکنه و این موردی که واقعا من از ایشون تشکر میکنم که این سختی رو پذیرفتن و قبول کردن و ما نمیتونستیم این کار رو به تعویق هم بندازیم به خاطر اینکه ایشون در انتهای، یعنی در آخر اینکه بعد از اینکه بلافاصله بعد از اینکه از تزشون دفاع میکنن دارن به فرانسه میرن و در انستیتو ادوانس استادی آف تولوز فرانسه دارن یه فلوشیپ دیگه میگذرونن برای مدت 1 سال و ما دیگه اگر این جولای رو از دست میدادیم تا یه سال دیگه به ایشون دسترسی نداشتیم که خدا رو شکر البته دوباره سال 2022 ایشون برمیگرده و آردی دانشگاه پن استیت از ایشون دعوت کرده به عنوان اسیستنت پروفسور در دپارتمان پالیتیکال ساینس شروع به کار بکنن که فکر میکنم در مراحلی هستن که ایشون هم دوست دارن و اکسپت کردن. به هر صورت من واقعا از طرف خودم و از طرف همه شما از ایشون تشکر میکنم. اجازه بدید که چند کلمه من برگردم انگلیسی و سویچ بکنم برای دوستانی که فارسی زبان نیستن. Just to welcome them to our program. Thank you very much for all of you joining us tonight, and also to introduce our guest speaker tonight, Mr. Daniel Tawana, that I believe that we should call him Dr. Daniel Tawana, particularly not to really mix it up with his Dr. Tawana, his father. Mr. Tawana is a fellow at the Council on Middle East Studies at Yale University and a PhD candidate in the Department of Politics and Princeton University. He will be a research fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study in Toulouse, France for 1 year. In fall 2022, he will join the Department of Political Science at Penn State University as an assistant professor in political science. Okay, join me to welcome Dr. Tawana, and congratulations for your great achievements. We are so proud of you.
Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone for joining, and to Dr. Nahid for that wonderful introduction. I'm gonna try to share my screen here very quickly. Okay, I think you should be able to see it. If not, somebody just, I won't be able to see the chat. So if something is wrong or it's frozen, just jump in. But thank you again so much for the invitation. I'm really honored to be here to speak with all of you tonight. And of course, very excited to present some of my work and research on public opinion and survey research and social and political life in Iran. I'm especially excited to speak with the Iranian American community, of course, of which I am a part on the East Coast. I know that many of you are deeply invested in Iran's future and engaged in Iranian politics and society, as well as the relationship between the United States and Iran, of course. And so I'm particularly eager to hear your feedback and answer your questions and hear more about how some of the findings that I'm going to present tonight relate or connect or don't to some of your own experiences, either in Iran or with Iranian Americans here in the US. And of course, I wish that we could be in person. There's no substitute for an in-person meeting, but I think together we'll make the best of it. We'll make the best of it tonight. My talk today is going to be about the Iran Social Survey. The Iran Social Survey is an ongoing survey-based study of social, economic, and political life in Iran. I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about what this survey is and what we are trying to accomplish with it, its goals and methodology. And then although the survey itself covers a wide variety of subjects and areas and different kind of research topics, I'm going to focus on three tonight: religion and associational life in Iran, ethnicity and linguistic identity in Iran, and voter behavior in Iran. I picked these topics, of course, not just because they're interesting to me and because I know a few things about them, but also because I think these are related to a lot of recent debates happening inside Iran, of course, about the nature of religion, the religiosity of Iranian citizens or not. Of course, ethnic and linguistic politics is always, a hot topic inside Iran and even amongst communities outside of Iran in the diaspora. And then voter behavior. We just had a recent election. And so I thought I would present and talk a little bit about that. Over the course of the talk, I'm going to show, and then, sorry, at the end, I'm going to have a conversation about whether or not we can trust the data. Some of it is, of course, doing survey research in a context like Iran, where things are relatively controlled and undemocratic and quite repressive, brutally at times. Doing this kind of work is of course not without its challenges. And so I want to have a little bit of a discussion about that in anticipation of what I know will be certainly questions about some of that as well. I'm going to show you a lot of data and plots and different images throughout the talk. I hope that's okay. I'll try not to move too quickly, but if at any point I'm not explaining something clearly or you want more information, I'm okay with an interruption, or if I'm going too fast, please feel free to stop me. The audience, I know, will have different levels of familiarity and exposure to social and political life in Iran, of course. And so at times I'll try and be a little slower and walk through things people of my generation may not have heard of or be familiar with. And I hope that's okay as well. The idea for the Iran Social Survey, the Iran Social Survey sort of came up in response to a question or a kind of issue that my co-author and I, Kevon Harris, a sociologist at the University of California, Los Angeles, had about much of what we were reading about Iran in foreign and even some domestic media sources. And we realized, I think, over the course of many conversations that we actually know of very little systematically about social, political, and economic life in Iran, especially at the level of the ordinary citizen. Most of what we do know comes from sort of impressionistic journalistic accounts or anecdotes, very limited government data, some of which we can't necessarily trust or take at face value, and other sort of longer term scholarly work that isn't necessarily produced by scholars in the country for a range of different reasons. And so what we sought to do was collect through a survey a lot of different data on socioeconomic features of Iranian residents, as well as their political behavior. Of course, we're not the first to do this. Even before the revolution, during the time of the Shah, surveys had been conducted by Iranian and foreign trained sociologists in the country. But I think that we're among the first to kind of begin to look more systematically at social and political life using rigorous methods and questions in the social sciences, and doing so every irregular amount of years. And so I'll try and talk a little bit about these things. What we wanted to kind of do with the survey was submit a lot of assumptions that we had or we had heard about Iran or others have about Iran to rigorous empirical testing. So what can we take from methodology in the social sciences and apply it to Iran to try and get answers to some of these questions? We focus on behaviors primarily, not sensitive attitudes. So of course, in a place like Iran, conducting any kind of survey can be politically sensitive or viewed by the government as being sort of taboo or unwanted for a variety of different reasons. And so for this reason, we try to avoid questions about topics that are very polarizing and very sensitive. So questions about lifestyle, taboo topics like drug use, sexual activity, these kinds of questions, attitudes towards the United States, attitudes towards democracy. Not only do I think a survey like this is probably not the best way to get answers to those questions, but for obvious reasons, we kind of think that citizens may be less willing to kind of share truthful answers to some of these questions. As I mentioned, we hope to do this every 4 years. We conducted the first wave of the survey in 2016, the survey I'll talk about today. Due to COVID, we had to bump our 2020 survey by 1 year. But our hope is that this is a regular thing that happens every 4 years. And so we're always looking for partners and funding agencies to sort of support us in doing this kind of work every 4 years. Broadly, there are 4 research modules. So we look at intergenerational, occupational, and geographic mobility. Iranian society has urbanized dramatically in the past several decades. There's been a lot of migration within the country, and we want to know where this migration is coming from and to, and what that sort of looks like on a national level. We also want to know a little bit more about people's occupation, employment by the state, public sector employment versus private sector, and so what the sort of landscape of that looks like. Many of you, of course, already know that the Iranian state distributes a large amount of welfare to different types of citizens, for example, war veterans or the poor. And so we want to understand too how citizens interact with the state and the state's welfare institutions. And the last two modules, ethno-linguistic identity, language identity, and political participation, I'll talk about today in a little bit more detail. The Iran Social Survey has over 200 variables, and it's available to social scientists both in Iran and abroad who, with a few hoops people have to jump through, but it's available for individuals who want to do social science analysis and analyze the data for publication in academic research papers. I want to talk just a little bit about the methodology of the survey before I sort of jump into some of the biggest findings. This is a nationally representative probability sample. There are 5,005, so an N of 5,000 size survey. Most phone surveys in the United States, most of the ones that you'll see on TV, for example, are significantly smaller, ranging anywhere from 600 to 1,500 interviews or respondents. Our hope was that a larger sample would give us a little bit more sort of analytical leverage to look at different subgroups of the population in a little bit more detail. We conducted the survey from November 2016 to December 2016, so it's already been some time. And all of the interviews were conducted by telephone. And we use a technique called random digit dialing, which I'm happy to talk about in more detail in the Q&A a little bit, to make sure that our sample is representative of the broader population. The sample itself is stratified by province and settlement size. So what this means is that there are a number of citizens in the sample proportional to the number of citizens in each province in Iran. And that way we make sure that there are equal number of citizens in the sample as there are in different settlement types. So for example, administrative divisions in Iran are province or ostan, county or shahristan, and then within counties there are bakhsh, like think of them like sections. And then bakhsh are divided into different shahr, cities, and dehistan, which is like a rural district. And so we want to make sure that we have within each ostan or province that the sample is representative across all of those different types of cities by size. Our research is funded by Princeton University and the Swedish Council for the Humanities and Social Sciences. We don't accept and have never accepted any government funding for this research. We think that helps us communicate the results more honestly and more convincingly. And so that's something that's really important to us. Given the sensitive nature of conducting this kind of work in Iran, we take research ethics very seriously. For example, we make sure that the data as it is sort of produced, the phone calls are immediately destroyed and no record is kept, and that every effort is taken to ensure that the respondents who are answering the phone and participating in our survey, information about their identity is not collected in any way. And we have no evidence that we've seen so far or that other surveys have seen to suggest that in any way does the Iranian government sort of track these different types of interviews. And I can talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A as well. Surveys are very common in Iran. Politicians run surveys, religious organizations run surveys, companies run surveys. And so these are, we're entering an ecosystem that is already quite crowded, and for the past several decades especially has been growing in its sophistication over time. As I mentioned, I want to try and cover today 3 topics. The first is religion. What I'm going to talk about in particular are hayat-hay mazhabi, or neighborhood religious groups, mosque attendance, and attendance at namaz jomeh, or Friday prayer. I'm also, like I said, going to talk about ethno-linguistic identity. So I'm going to talk about how citizens view themselves ethnically in ethnic terms and how they self-identify by ethnicity. And I'm going to talk a little bit about linguistic identity and language use, and how that has changed over time in Iran. And then last, I'm going to talk about citizen participation in the 2016 Majlis Shura, or Consultative Assembly, or parliamentary elections, and who individuals voted for in that election, and how they described who they voted for. I'm going to focus primarily on looking at variation in each of these variables or topics by gender identity, age, and education. There are a lot of different ways we can look at this data using the Iran Social Survey, but I think these three are the most interesting and relevant, and the kinds of demographic variables that most people, I think, would be interested in seeing how these different things are shaped by these three factors. So moving to religion and associational life first, I want to begin by looking at neighborhood religious groups, or as I mentioned, Hayat-Hay Mazhabi. This photo here is of a neighborhood religious group in Esfahan. This is a women's religious group where they're being gathered to learn about recycling in particular and how to engage in recycling activities in the area in which they live. Many Iranians, many Iranians who were in Iran during or before the revolution, remember these neighborhood religious organizations as being a very important social component of the Iranian revolution. These organizations were very important in mobilizing citizens during the revolution, and even before and even after. There are thousands of them, and they range a lot in their different degrees of formality, right? So all Hayat-Hay Mazhabi have to be recognized and register with the state, but some are really large organizations connected to mosques or religious leaders, and others are much smaller kind of neighborhood organizations that are far less formal. So we want to know whether or not citizens, Iranians, actively belong to and participate in a neighborhood religious group, or whether they belong and are not so active, whether they used to belong, or whether they have never belonged, right? So we think of this as like a much better way to ask about people's religiosity or how religious they are. And I can talk a little bit more about why that's the case in the Q&A for those of you who are interested. We want to know about citizens belonging to these organizations or groups and what the landscape of that looks like across the different demographic areas I mentioned. So first, as we can see here, about a third of the population responds and says that they belong and actively participate in a neighborhood religious group. Of course, with age, this increases. So less than 30% of young people under the age of 35, between the ages of 18 and 35, report participating in one of these groups, belonging and actively participating in. But of course, much older Iranians, as you get older, the likelihood increases, and the percentage who are in each of those age cohorts who are participating in these religious groups increases by a lot. This is again to many people who have written about sort of levels of decline in religiosity in Iran, particularly among youth. This might not be a huge surprise, although one could also say that, you know, a third of young people participating actively in one of these religious groups may be higher than what they thought. Interestingly, we break this out by gender, right? And so what we find is actually men are not participating they're not less likely to participate in these religious organizations, irrespective of their age. It's actually women that are leading the decline among the 18 to 34-year-old age group in participation in these religious organizations. So among 18 to 34-year-olds, for example, men are twice as likely to belong and actively participate in a neighborhood religious organization. Only 20% of women in the same age group do, whereas 40% of men in the same age group do. And of course, among women, as age increases, the percentage of women who belong and actively participate in these groups is much higher. So this kind of presents a little bit of a different picture of participation in these groups. Looking at education, we also see a lot of differences here. So we break out education according to whether or not the respondent has less than a secondary or high school education, whether or not they have only a high school education, or whether or not they have a bachelor's degree or higher. And what we find is that those who have less than a secondary education, about 40% report belonging and actively participating in a neighborhood religious group. But among more educated Iranians, and this is about 30% of the sample, only 26% of those citizens say that they belong and actively participate in a neighborhood religious group. And when we break this down by gender, again, in education, we can see relatively similar trends here. As education increases, both men and women are less likely to belong and actively participate in the Hayat-Hoya Mazhabi or neighborhood religious group. We also ask about mosque attendance. This is a sort of a small mosque in Bakhsh Gulistan in Iran, in Tehran. In one form or another, most people, I think, our viewers will be familiar with what mosques are and what they do. They're traditional places of worship. In Iran, they're particularly important places where Friday prayers are held. I'll get to that in a minute. And they're similar to the Hayat-Hoya Mazhabi in that we're interested in frequency of attendance and belonging to these particular religious organizations in Iran. And here what we find is actually generally citizens report belonging to and actively participating in a mosque or religious organization in somewhat fewer numbers than the Hayat-Hoya Mazhabi. This was somewhat surprising to us and not something that I think going into the survey we expected. Among 18 to 34-year-olds, only about 17% of citizens say that they belong and actively participate in a mosque or similar religious organization. But among much older Iranians, of course, that number doubles to about 31%, right? And I don't think that given some of the other research that we've seen from Iran and other recent writing on Iran, it won't be a surprise to many that younger generations are generally less likely to belong to and actively participate in the activities of a mosque or a religious organization. But here again, we see differences between men and women. Women are again far less likely at a young age to participate in, to belong and actively participate in mosques or religious organizations. Only 11% of women who are between the ages of 18 and 35 report belonging and actively participating belonging and actively participating in the activities of a mosque, whereas among men, it's much higher, right? So of course, the age effect is still there, but the curve is much steeper for women, suggesting that again, women are sort of less likely than men to participate in these, to participate in mosques and religious organizations. And again, in education, what we see is that when we break it down when we break down the survey by education, we see that there's not that much difference in mosque attendance between those who have a high school education or those who have a bachelor's degree or higher. They both belong and actively participate in mosques or religious organizations at similar numbers, but those with less than a secondary education are far, far higher. So this is also not something that I think we expected. We expected, given some of the other work we've seen, that those who have less than a secondary education were more likely to belong and participate in mosque-based activities. But we didn't expect to see those with a high school education and a bachelor's degree to be relatively similar. But across men and women, again, there are no real differences in education, right? We see most of those effects in age, as we did for the past two variables. The last aspect of religious life in Iran that I want to talk about is Friday prayer and attendance at Friday prayer. How often are citizens going to Friday prayer and participating in these events? This is Hojatul Islam Mahmoud Torabi. He's the Imam Namaz Jomeh in Gunbad Kavus in Golestan. these Friday prayers, of course, as many of you know, tend to be more overtly political in nature. This is especially the case in big cities. In rural areas and in villages, of course, Friday sermons are a little bit more, are less politicized generally, but in big cities, they tend to be more directly political with sort of political overtones. And so what we do in our survey is we ask each participant in the survey, how often do you participate in the following activities? Attend Namaz Jomeh or Sunday services, and we give them options. So they report never, sometimes, never, rarely, sometimes, most of the time, or always. So it's a scale from 1 to 5, right? And so what I've done here in each of these different age categories and each of these different age bins is sort of binned as sort of average score, right? And what we see generally is that 50 to 64-year-olds are more likely to participate or attend Friday prayers in person. There's not very much of a difference between 18 to 35-year-olds and 35 to 49-year-olds, which was somewhat interesting for us. But in general, there's not a huge difference by age in terms of who is attending Friday prayer in Iran. Here again, we see some differences amongst differences by gender, although they're not as, I think, pointed as some of the previous slides I showed you. Younger 18 to 34-year-olds, men, are actually more likely to attend Friday prayer than 35 to 49-year-old men. This is, again, something interesting to us and not something that we anticipated. And of course, if you look at the women, as each age cohort increases, there's an increase in the likelihood of participation in attendance at Friday prayer, right? So if you think of, 2.15 or 2.5, it's sort of it's sort of somewhere in the middle of the scale, and so that's sort of what we're interested in. What about in education, right? So here, interestingly, we don't find, although we do find differences in the participation of those without a secondary education in Hayat-Hoya Mazhabi and mosques, we don't really see these effects at Friday prayer, which is to us, again, somewhat interesting. Those without a secondary education or less are more likely to attend Friday prayer, but it's not a huge difference. It's certainly not as steep as the differences we saw with Hayat-Hoya Mazhabi and mosque participation, which suggests to us that Friday prayer generally tends to be, although it is a very gendered, male-driven space, tends to be a more egalitarian place where there's more mixing across different across different socioeconomic classes. And some other data we have in our survey kind of tells us more about that too. In looking at differences by gender, again, by education, we don't really find huge differences. Women who are more educated are less likely to participate or less likely to attend Friday prayer as education increases, although there isn't much of a difference between secondary education and having a BA or higher. Whereas for men, it's sort of a little bit more similar. But all in all, there's not much difference. Women are, of course, less likely to attend overall, but men across education cohorts are sort of similar. Okay, I know I've presented a lot of plots and I'm throwing a lot of data at you, but I'm hoping that at least some of it is sticking, and that some of it, I think, kind of will at least get some questions going for the Q&A, which I hope we'll have time for. Moving on, I want to talk a little bit about ethnicity and linguistic identity next in the survey. This photo here is of leaders of Arab and Bakhtiyar tribes in southwestern Iran, in Khuzestan, during a recent election. The question of ethnicity in Iran is very complicated and difficult to answer. When we think about ethnicity in the US, for example, typically we think of racial categories, of which there are 5: white, white American, Black American, Asian American, American Indian or Alaskan Native, or Native and Pacific Islander or Hawaiian American. In Iran, these racial categories are not as salient, right? We tend to think more about ethnicity. And we think about ethnicity in the US too, but the official sort of recognition by the census of ethnicity is whether or not you are of Hispanic or Latin origin, right? And of course, this is very different in the way ethnicity is discussed and thought about in Iran is very different for 2 reasons. First, there's really no official data. Under the Shah and in 1986 census, the Iranian government collected data on who could and could not speak Farsi, or whether or not Farsi was their first language, and what other languages an individual spoke. But at this point today, the Iranian government, at least publicly, does not collect any data on the language use or language identity of its citizens, and it does not report that information in any census or any other government information that I have seen. This is, of course, in part because there is a perception among the Iranian government and even many in Iran that ethnicity is sensitive. It's politically sensitive and is something that can be used to sort of encourage ethnic-based separatism or other sorts of oppositional movements in the country that are based on ethnic grievances. In Iran, there are sort of 5 categories of difference that are very common: ethnicity, language, religion, nominal minority status, and tribe or tribal affiliation. 3 of these categories, ethnicity, language, and religion, are sort of most important. And here's how we try and address this in the survey. So as a sort of baseline, we want to know which ethnic group Iranians self-identify with, right? So Persian, Azeri Turk, Lor, Kurd, Gilaki, or Mazandarani, what I'll refer to as Caspian in a bit, Qashqai, Baluch, Arab, Turkmen, other, refused, or don't know. And so we ask about qawmiyat, which is the literal translation of the word ethnicity. And interestingly, what we find is that broadly, right, these sort of rates of responses kind of are consistent with what we think. But about a quarter of people in our survey report that they don't know how to answer this question, right? Now, there are many ways you could interpret that. I think that even if we were to ask this question in a place like the US, you would get very high rates of either don't know or refused or other, or people who don't think of themselves in ethnic terms or belonging to an ethnic group. And so this number to us was high and surprising, but maybe not all that surprising, given some of the other things we know about Iran, and especially given that ethnic identity in Iran is not always connected to a sort of racial or ethnic kind of category, but rather a linguistic identity, right? And so one of the innovations we make in the survey is to ask people about their linguistic identity. And we think this gets us at a much more precise and frankly more interesting understanding of variation of ethnicity across the country. So we ask each person in the survey, what was the primary language that you spoke in your household when you were a child? And what we find is only about 55% spoke Persian or Farsi, about 18% speak, Turk, 7% Kurd, 5% Caspian. I use the word Caspian to refer to Gilaki and Mazandarani. Some people would describe these as Shomali, but there are other languages that we might consider as Shomali that are not included in those 2. And so I wanted to separate these. And then Lor, 5%, Baluch and Arab, 1%, right? And so I think this is sort of generally consistent with what others have reported in Iran, but this is sort of, I think, a more precise question about language identity. Of course, those of you who travel to Iran frequently or stay in contact with your family in Iran might know that, of course, the language that people speak in their household today may not be the language that their mother or father spoke in their household when they were younger. And so we also ask about that. We asked each person who took the survey, what was the primary language that your father or mother spoke in his or her household when he or she was growing up? And here the results are a lot more interesting. If you look at, for example, Persian, only 40% of respondents say that their father and mother spoke Persian in their household when they were younger, compared to 55% who said they spoke Persian in their households when they were younger. This suggests that over time, and Persian being the state dominant language, Persian is becoming more dominant, and that many people whose parents may have spoken a language when they were younger in the household, their children are not doing so in Iran. And we can talk about why that might be the case, and specifically for which groups this is happening to. And it seems to be happening in larger numbers for Turks than across most other groups. So if you look, for example, at Baluch and among Arabs, language use is pretty consistent across generations. This is the same for Lur, although there's a slight difference, as well as Gilaki and Mazandarani and Kurd. But for Turkish, 18% of respondents say they spoke it in their household when they were children growing up, even though 22 and 23% say that their parents spoke it in their households when they were growing up. This is some sort of very tentative evidence that language identity is being lost over time, particularly among this group. Although, as you can see, it's sort of the black dot is a little bit lower across all groups. And so it's happening across all of these different groups. Okay. I think I have maybe 10 minutes left. Stop me if that's not true. But I want to get to voter behavior. As many of you know, Iran had an election very recently. Here is a photo from after the 2016 election, the parliamentary election, which I'm going to talk a little bit about today. We conducted our survey in November of 2016, about 5 or 6 months after the 2016 election. So we were able to ask all respondents who they voted for in the Majlis Shura elections. For those of you who are not so familiar with Iranian electoral politics, there's 290 seats in the Majlis Shura, or Iranian parliament. Each member serves a 4-year term. The country is divided into 207 districts, which elect anywhere from 1 to 6 seats. Tehran is an exception, which elects 30 seats. For those of you who do follow Iranian politics, you'll know that political parties, formal political parties and party organizations that nominate candidates don't exist in Iran. But there are these sort of broad kind of factions at the national level that organize lists and nominate or endorse candidates who are running in different districts. These are reformists, Islah Talaban, moderates, Jabheh Etidal, those who are affiliated with former President Rouhani, and Usulgarayan, principalists, as they're called in English, or conservatives, right? The Shuraya Nehraban, the Guardian Council, has very tight control over who can run in all Iranian elections. By no means are these free and fair elections. The people who can run are a very small minority of people who nominate themselves, let alone those who don't even bother to nominate themselves. And so elections are generally very tightly controlled, but there is some competition and there is some meaningful differences in people who are voting for these types of groups. And this is what we wanted to see, right? So we wanted to see like how, for example, voting varies across educational categories or age categories or by gender. Formally, this system is called a multiple non-transferable voting system. All that means is that you have as many votes as there are seats in your electoral district. and that if nobody receives 25% of the vote in the district, there's a runoff election between the top vote getters. So we asked people in the election, first, did you vote or not? And what we find is that turnout was about 62% in our survey, which is very close to what it was in the formal election. So our survey gives us some tentative evidence that the participation rate and turnout in the 2016 election, I can't speak for other elections, was what the government in fact reported. But interestingly, when we asked the people who did vote, which political group or faction did most of the candidates you voted for belong, we see a lot of variation. So about 20% say Islah Taliban or reformists, about 20% say conservatives, much less, 6% say moderates, these are Jabhaya I'tidal, 10% say mixed, right? So you can vote for more than one candidate. People are mixing candidates from different groups. And then about 10% say independents or others, people who are not affiliated with these sort of ideological factions at the national level. But a third of people say don't know. And this was very unexpected for us when we conducted the survey. And it's something I think we're still trying to think about and improve upon in further questions, right? Often when we read about elections in Iran, we hear of sort of these big ideological battles between reformists and conservatives, but a large number of citizens don't think of politics in that way. Maybe they have a member of parliament they vote for because that person belongs to their ethnic or linguistic identity group, or that person is a businessman in the district, or something else, right? And so this is something in future work we want to get to know a little bit better. Interestingly, we see very few differences across women, across gender. The percentage, however, the percentage of don't knows, there's huge differences between men and women here. As many of you know, voting in Iran, although generally turnout rates between men and women are relatively equal, voting is a very patriarchal act in Iran. Voting is very heavily controlled by the head of the family often. And so this is something also we want to look at in more detail. But amongst reformists and conservatives, there isn't too big of a difference by, amongst men and women. So here we also look at education. So interestingly, among those, what we find is that the more educated you are, the more likely you are to view politics as a battle between reformists and conservatives. So this was also very interesting to us, and it kind of has encouraged us to think more, a little more seriously about how the poorly educated in Iran vote and participate in elections. So if you look at don't know, for example, those who have less than a secondary education, over half of them do not know whether or not the person they voted for was a reformist or conservative. But among those who have a bachelor's degree or higher, that number is only 16%. That suggests to us that people of different socioeconomic status in Iran are experiencing the elections in different ways. The more educated are voting sort of ideologically, right? But those who are less educated are not necessarily viewing elections in that way. Or maybe it's an information problem, right? And so this is something that's interesting to us, but that I think deserves a lot more study. And then last, very quickly, because I'm running out of time, we look at this by age, right? And interestingly, what we find is that both young people are just as likely to vote for reformists and conservatives, right? We don't know if that's because young people are high information voters, right? Or something else. But generally, for those who've argued that, you know, the younger generation is much more pro-reformist or much more opposed to conservatives, we don't really see these differences in the data. It's very small, but it's still generally the same across these two political groups. And then, of course, the older you get, the higher the don't know becomes, right? And here we think this is a question of information. Okay, I've gone a little bit too long. Sorry about that. Can we trust the data? I think this is sort of the question that we always get, and it's something we've taken a lot of time to try and make sure we're using the most advanced methods in the social sciences to sort of make sure that the data is of high quality and trustworthy. We've done a lot to sort of institute different quality controls at different parts of the data collection process. We've used various statistical methods to check to see if the data is falsified. And most of those, excuse me, all of those have always come up sort of negative. We've never found any sort of falsification or inconsistency in our data that would cause us to be alarmed about the data quality. Where possible, we try to validate the data using census and government data. Of course, in a context like Iran, I think being a healthy skeptic of government data at least is important, but that doesn't mean that the data is unusable. And where we can match the data we have with government data and see what matches and what doesn't, we can learn something. Response rates are very high. So for those of you familiar with the US context, you'll know that when you do a phone survey in the US, most people hang up immediately. You've all probably had some of those phone calls. Response rates in the US are between 5 to 10% max on a telephone survey. In Iran, it was 64%, excluding partial interviews. So partial interviews are people who didn't like the survey, excuse me, and hung up halfway through. Iran is a very undersaturated market. People aren't used to, especially on their landlines, getting inundated with spam and phone calls. And so we think this has something to do with it. But it also suggests to us that, especially given that we're not asking directly sensitive questions or taboo type questions, it generally suggests to us that people are willing to participate and talk about these subjects. I will stop there. Thank you so much for listening. I'm sorry if I took a little bit too long, but I'm eager to hear your feedback and your questions, and looking very forward to your comments. And I do hope that even after the talk, we can all stay in touch.
خیلی ممنون دکتر توانا، خسته نباشید. ما چند تا سوال داریم. البته فکر میکنم این سوال حتما به فارسی هم شما متوجه میشید. اولین سوال ما اینه که در سالهای گذشته یک نظرسنجی شده که اعلام شده از دانشگاه مریلند بوده، ولی این نظرسنجی خیلی مشکوکه و البته نوشتن که فیکه. حالا من فیکیشو نمیدونم، ولی به هر صورت مشکوکه. سوال کردن که آیا شما از این نظرسنجی اطلاعی دارید یا نه؟ این اولین سواله.
Thank you. I'm going to answer in English if that's okay.
Sure.
I have no reason to believe that some of those. Let me back up. Whenever people don't like the results of a survey, they tend to accuse those who are either behind the survey or funding it generally of having produced data that is of a low quality. I will say I don't know specifically the specifics. The University of Maryland produces quite a large number of surveys. There were a few in particular that produced surprising results that led to some of the controversy that's I think the person asking the question is referring to. But for me, it's a question of methodology, and I haven't seen anything to suggest that I haven't seen anything to suggest that those surveys are of a poor quality or that the data is untrustworthy. I will also say that this is why we avoid what the University of Maryland does is they'll ask questions about, for example, support for the United States or support for the nuclear agreement. These are really hard questions to ask people in Iran because opinions change quite often and it's very volatile, right? And so a lot of people, it's also in an environment where there is not a free or open media. And so the individual's access to information is not just generally low, but vastly unequal. And so I think this produces kind of a similar type of dynamic where, we have questions that are sort of attitudinal type questions, and there's so much change in them over time, even, a couple of different months, and it leads people to question whether or not that data is honest. But I know the individuals who work at the University of Maryland, they do really good work. Sometimes surveys produce findings that we can't necessarily explain, or they're a product of their context or an environment. And I think we should study those and know more about how the data is generated to sort of figure these things out. But from a data quality perspective, I have no reason to think that that data was falsified or fake in any way.
قبل از اینکه به سوال بعدی بپردازیم، من میخواستم خواهش بکنم که اگر کسی میخواد سوال بکنه به صورت به اصطلاح با وایس سوال بکنه، توی چت بگه که مدیر برنامه ما آنمیوت بکنتشون و مستقیما از آقای توانا سوال بکنید. ولی خیلی سوال داریم. یه سوال دیگه ای که من سوالا رو بعضیا به فارسی هست، من حالا به فارسی میخونم، اگه خواستید من ترجمهش میکنم. ولی سوال دیگه میگه که چرا سروی شما گزینه رأی نمیدهم ندارد؟
Which one is?
I think that was the curve or the study about the election or the voting system. That was actually my own question too, that I thought that, have you started with the question that, have you asked with this question that if they have voted or not, and then continued with this part, because that is the first step of it. I think that question would somewhat relate to my question too.
Yeah, so in the survey, in whenever you conduct a survey anywhere in the world about elections, there is, people don't like to admit that they didn't vote. In the US, for example, when we conduct surveys, we find that compared to the real level of turnout and what's reported in a survey, people generally tend to say that they voted in higher numbers, even though turnout is different. This is because that when they're on the phone to a stranger, they don't want to admit that they didn't vote. So one thing we do in the survey is we call this a form of social desirability bias in the social sciences. One thing we do in the survey is, first we ask them, many people, this was the date of the election, so they know the date. Many people voted in the election, although many people didn't because they were busy or couldn't find time or had to work. So we tried to minimize the social desirability. And then we say which one of these options best describes you. And we show them, I voted, I didn't vote because I was busy, I didn't vote this time, but I usually vote. So we give them options to minimize that social desirability. And then to those who say that they did vote, then we ask them about who they voted for, how many candidates they voted for, which political groups they voted for, these kinds of questions. So we kind of filter it out in an effort to make sure that the question is measured as scientifically as possible.
سوال بعدی هست که have you been to Iran or all the surveys were conducted by telephone?
I have not been to Iran. I would love to one day, and hopefully I will one day go. All of these surveys are conducted by telephone. Face-to-face surveys are done in Iran. As I mentioned, methods and techniques and organizations inside Iran have become increasingly more sophisticated. Politicians survey citizens. A lot of marketing firms survey citizens. It's quite common. And so we're, as I mentioned earlier, we're entering into an ecosystem that's already quite saturated. But I still, given some of the issues with given that there are still perceptions of sensitivity around the survey, or there could be perceptions of sensitivity around the survey, I think it's best for us to stick with a phone survey, provided that we can do so and collect high quality data. And I think that we can.
سوال دیگه این هست که how does the RDD provide a representative cross-section of the Iranian society?
Yeah, this is a great question. So phone subscription, landline phone subscription is very high. It's slightly higher in urban areas than it is in rural areas. This is, of course, not surprising. And so the RDD, what it basically does is it will call randomly a telephone number, right? And given the way that the subscriptions in Iran for fixed landlines work, the survey organization will know generally what part of the country it's calling. And then in the actual survey, of course, with the respondents, we gather more information. So we asked, for example, which Shahristan they live in order to confirm what part of the country that they live in. So the phone subscription rates, and then using the census data, we're able to allocate the sample to individual parts of the countries, and then randomly generate a phone number to call in that particular area for the sample itself. I hope I've answered the question in a not so confusing way.
سوال بعدی هست که are you going to do this kind of survey for recent election in Iran?
Yeah, so we're actually hoping to do it this fall. We were planning to do it actually last year after the parliamentary election, but because of the pandemic and because that election, the 2016 election, as you may remember, was actually more open than this past 2020 election. So in the 2016 election, generally reformists were able to participate in higher numbers. In the 2020 parliamentary election, not only were reformists sort of generally not allowed to participate, but even like a third of the two-thirds, I forget the exact number, but two-thirds of the members of parliament who were already in parliament were disqualified from running in the election. And so it was just a much more repressive, uncompetitive election. And this has unfortunately been the trend that the Iranian government has moved in. The most recent presidential election is sort of evidence of that, where no real competitor is allowed to run. There's very tight control over the electoral process. And so the outcome is, I don't want to say predetermined, but it's an outcome that, you know, the election was designed to produce a specific result, and there were certainly surprises in the election, but generally that's what it did. So we still are going to do this survey after in this fall, and we're going to ask about the presidential election. I think one thing that's very interesting to me is the very high number of spoiled and blank ballots. We want to know what's behind this. And so we are hoping to do it if everything goes as planned in the fall.
سوال بعدی هست have you or do you plan to conduct comparable surveys in other countries in the Middle East to see how Iran fares in terms of such metrics as how democratic the country is relative to its peers, etc. How hard do you think it would be to conduct a comparable survey in other countries in the Middle East, such as Egypt, Saudi Arabia, UAE, etc.?
Yeah, I'm so happy that you asked this question. That's one of the goals of the survey. I think there is a tendency among scholars of contemporary Iran to sort of think that Iran is this very exceptional country that could not possibly be compared with other middle-income countries around the world, or even other countries in the region. And so one of the things that we want to do with the survey is to sort of make those comparisons. And so we do a few things in the survey to kind of address that. So most of the questions we ask are borrowed from other cross-national surveys. So we take like the best of the best questions in other places, and then we adapt them to Iran. And so this ensures that someone could, for example, take our survey data and do their own sets of comparisons to other middle-income countries or other countries in the region that they may want to know, sort of see these things side by side. And so that's something you absolutely could do with this data. I myself, I've done surveys in Egypt, in Lebanon. I'm working on others in Kuwait and Tunisia. And some of these are similar. My broader research is about elections in the Middle East. And so I think in some places there are different sets of challenges and different local laws you have to sort of worry about. Tunisia and Lebanon is they're generally places that are open to survey research historically. Although they have other challenges, of course, in both countries right now. Egypt in recent years, less so, and the rest of the Gulf, less so as well. Kuwait is generally pretty open to it. But in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar, it's you can do surveys in those countries, but asking about sensitive questions, there's a lot of variation in your ability to ask them. And so I think in a lot of places like Jordan, Morocco, Palestine, Lebanon, Tunisia, you could ask these questions and probably more. But in other places, I think it's sort of similar to Iran. And of course, in some places, it's even more repressive than Iran. And they're even more hostile to foreign researchers who do this kind of research.
سوال بعدی هست. Iran is a controlled state. The person you contacted in your survey might suspect that their phone is controlled by the government, so the answer might be tainted as a result. And there is also another comment. I don't know if I can go on with that. Sure. I believe that because these are the same, from the same audience. It is, they observe, this is an observation, they state that women are not quite free to attend meetings on their own. That may be the reason your data shows lower attendance than men in religious gatherings.
Absolutely. So let me take the second point first. As I mentioned, these are very, not only are these very gendered spaces, but they're very gender segregated spaces. And so this is, of course, one reason why the inability of women to attend these different meetings or religious gatherings or hayat-hay mazhabi or hayat-hay azadi, whatever they might be, or mosques. Of course, this is a very big part of it. And I think we'll have to do a lot more research, I think, to be able to get at whether or not, like, to what extent this is exerting the kind of pressure on the data that we see. I think it's certainly fair that some people might not, some people who are on the phone might think that the government is listening to what they say. I think that's certainly a fear that somebody in Iran might have. And and it might cause them to not participate in the survey. So of course, nobody is up at any time. Of course, anyone who is participating in the survey, or even before it begins, they can refuse to participate. They're not obligated to participate in any way. My hunch is that people who feel that the government may be listening are probably more likely to not participate at all than participate and give false information. I think it's certainly possible that people will participate and not be truthful in their answers. This is true of any survey anywhere in the world. But I think more likely it's the case that people who think or fear that the government may be listening to what's going on in their phone call opt out of the survey. I know from the various quality control efforts that we have in this survey that people occasionally do express this sort of skepticism, but it's not in sort of extremely large numbers. This is, again, for a couple reasons. First, we don't ask about criminal activity that's illegal, sexual activity, taboo topics, questions about religion that are about personal or individual behavior or anything like that. And we also try to make sure that whenever we do ask some of these questions, that respondents know that they can opt out of the survey. And so I take your point. I think it's certainly, even if that's happening, I think it's still, this is still data we want to collect, and we want to know what's happening. But it's certainly the case, I think, that a small percentage of people who participate in the survey may fear that and may be adjusting their answers accordingly.
فکر میکنم این نه هنوز یه سوال دیگه هم هست. من میخواستم این سوال رو بذارم برای آخر، ولی اجازه بدید که یه سوال دیگه اینجا هست بخونم. Would you please tell us how many people did you reach and how many accept and participate in your survey? البته گفتن که ببخشید اگر من ابتدای صحبت رو میس کردم، که فکر میکنم همینطور بود، چون شما گفتید که 5005 نفر مثلا که در این سروی شرکت کردن.
That's right. The sample size is 5,000 and the response rate in the survey is 64%. And that's excluding people who start to participate in the survey and then hang up because either they don't like the questions or they're too busy or they don't have time or whatever. So the response rate is quite high. I hope I've answered. But the total sample size is 5,000.
و این فکر میکنم آخرین سوال ما باشه که واقعا سوال خیلی سختیه، به خصوص برای شما که فکر میکنم هیچ وقت ایران نبودی، ایران به دنیا نیامدی، هیچ وقت ایران نرفتی، ولی اولا من واقعا I admire your compassion and concern about ایران. ولی یکی از دوستای ما سوال کرده What do you think about the possibility of another revolution in Iran? Have you surveyed it?
Yeah, I think it's you know, look, I think it's would hate to make a prediction and be wrong, so I won't make a prediction. But what I will say is that there is a very long 100-year or longer than 100-year history in Iran, dating back to the constitutional revolution and before, of people's mobilization for civil and political rights and more open and accountable and responsive political systems. And that was in part what many people were mobilizing for during the revolution and before. And for as authoritarian and repressive as the Iranian government is, there is still a lot of mobilization that goes on even today. I mean, we're seeing protests in Khuzestan just these past few weeks. The day protests in 2017, 2018, labor protests have been a constant source of a thorn in the government sides for the past 4 decades. And so mobilization and citizen activism for greater civil and political rights, it didn't stop with the revolution. It's been ongoing, and whether or not that will reach a point where the level of mobilization is what it was 40 years ago, I think it's very hard for me, especially somebody who hasn't been to Iran and does not live there, to make a kind of prediction like that. But I think that what I like to do for these questions is look at what's happening elsewhere, right? I mean, Iraq, Lebanon, Tunisia this week, other countries in the region. Looking, of course, there are countries that are generally a little poorer than Iran, but not significantly, like Sudan or even Algeria. All of these countries are experiencing mass mobilization and political transitions. That some of them are experiencing political transitions that are not unlike what Iran went through 40 years ago, and not unlike what could happen in Iran in a relatively, things change very, very quickly, and for those who were following the events of 2009, you might remember that too, but there's a very long history of this kind of mobilization, and we have a lot of comparative examples where we can kind of look to for both inspiration and an effort to kind of assess the successes and failures of those mobilizations and what they might mean for similar types of movements in Iran. And so, to me, those are the places that I look when I want to understand what might be coming and how that relates to what's happened. But I think to leave you with a prediction would be I don't think I can do that in good faith.
خیلی ممنون، واقعا سپاسگزار هستیم همه ما. من از طرف خودم، اعضای انجمن متخصصین ایرانیان در سان دیگو و تمام دوستانی که در این برنامه حضور دارن که تا این موقع شب، فکر میکنم ساعت 11:30 شب، شما اطلاعاتتو با ما شریک میشی و واقعا congratulations برای تمام اچیومنت هایی که شما به دست آوردید برای سابمیشن تز شما در همین هفته. آرزوی موفقیت بیشتر و بیشتر براتون میکنیم و خیلی ممنون. مجددا شبتون بخیر.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you guys. Have a nice night.